not one of them hanged. The men who broke the United States apart, who raised armies, burned cities, and killed hundreds of thousands of their own countrymen, walked free, every single one. And what they did next was so contradictory, so violent, so deeply strange, that the people who came after them spent 100 years making sure you would never find out. This is what was taken from you. The surrender happened in a quiet room. April 1865, Appomattox, Virginia. Robert E. Lee signed his name, set down his pen, and the Confederacy ceased to exist. The war that killed more Americans than any other conflict in the nation's history ended. Not with justice, not with executions, not with the kind of reckoning that the scale of the crime demanded. It ended with a handshake. Ulysses Grant made a verbal promise on the spot. Surrender, go home, and the government will not come after you. No trial, no gallows, no exile. Congress was furious. The radical Republicans wanted prosecutions. They wanted the law applied to men who had committed the most documented act of treason in American history. Senator Charles Sumner, who had already been beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor by a pro-slavery congressman, argued that leniency now would only delay the violence. He was right. But the political will for real accountability collapsed fast. President Andrew Johnson went even further than Grant. He issued sweeping pardons, nearly blanket amnesty, to Confederate officers within months of the surrender. Full restoration of rights. Clean slate. The men who had engineered the secession of 11 states were, by the end of 1865, legally indistinguishable from any other American citizen. But here is where the story the textbooks gave you stops, and where the real one begins. Because these men did not go quietly. They did not accept defeat with the dignity that Southern mythology would later assign them. They fractured. They splintered into 3 very different kinds of men, making 3 very different choices. And all 3 choices were so embarrassing, so contradictory, so damaging to the image the South needed to project, that each story was systematically buried. One of Lee's most trusted generals turned against everything he had fought for. He crossed the line and never came back. One of the Confederacy's most experienced soldiers looked at post-war America and decided it had nothing left to offer him. He left the continent entirely and went to work for a foreign ruler. And one built a terror network inside the United States, so organized, so brutal, so methodical in its violence, that it required a congressional investigation, multiple military crackdowns, and decades of sustained legal effort to even partially dismantle. None of this is speculation. All of it is documented, and almost none of it was in your history textbook, James Longstreet. If you know that name at all, you probably know it through the frame that was built around him after his death. The general who failed Lee at Gettysburg, the man whose hesitation cost the Confederacy its best chance at a decisive victory. That frame was constructed deliberately. It was a lie assembled from selective testimony, posthumous slander, and the furious revisionism of men who had very specific reasons to destroy his reputation. The truth is that Longstreet was one of Lee's most effective commanders. He performed with consistent tactical competence across 4 years of brutal combat. Lee trusted him repeatedly with the most difficult assignments. He was not the architect of Confederate failure. He was, by most serious historical analysis, one of the few senior Confederate officers whose battlefield judgment routinely held up under pressure. And when the war ended, Longstreet did something none of the others did. He looked at the outcome, accepted it as final, and changed. Not privately, publicly. He joined the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of Reconstruction, the party that the entire white South had declared its enemy. He wrote openly that the Confederacy had been wrong. He argued that the South's best path forward was to engage with the new political reality rather than resist it. He accepted a federal appointment from Ulysses Grant, his former West Point classmate, and now the President of the United States. His former comrades treated this as a kind of spiritual death. The Confederate veterans organizations condemned him. Southern newspapers called him a scalawag, a word used to describe white Southerners who cooperated with Reconstruction. Carrying all the contempt of a community that viewed cooperation as betrayal, the men who had fought beside him for 4 years now wrote him out of their memoirs, minimized his contributions, and began the process of constructing an alternative version of history in which Longstreet was the reason the South had lost. But the condemnation alone does not explain why his story was buried. What buried it was what happened in New Orleans in September 1874. A paramilitary organization called the White League, armed, organized, and explicitly dedicated to the violent overthrow of Louisiana's Reconstruction government, staged a coup attempt in the streets of the city. They were not a mob. They were structured, they had military discipline, and they came prepared for a fight. Roughly 3,500 men moved on the city's key positions. Standing in their way was a state militia, integrated, black and white soldiers, commanded by the city's police chief. James Longstreet, Confederate general, commanded part of the government's response. He led those integrated forces against the White League in the streets of his own city. He was shot during the engagement. He was captured and briefly held by the paramilitary forces. Forces that included men who had served under his command during the Civil War. He recovered. He kept his position. He continued to support Reconstruction. That story, a Confederate general commanding integrated militias against white supremacist paramilitaries, being shot by his former soldiers for doing so, is not the story of a man who fits neatly into the lost cause myth. It is the story of a man who made a choice the myth could not accommodate. So the myth discarded him. For roughly a century after his death, Longstreet's military reputation remained officially tarnished. The man who lost Gettysburg, the general who moved too slowly, the traitor to the cause. It took the sustained work of serious historians, most of them working well into the 20th century, to dismantle the slander piece by piece. He got a monument at Gettysburg decades after every other major general on both sides had been memorialized. The delay was not accidental. Now, while Longstreet was being shot in the streets of New Orleans, another Confederate general had already made his exit. William Wing Loring. Loring was a professional soldier before the Civil War existed. He had fought in multiple conflicts, survived wounds that would have ended most careers, and lost an arm in Mexico in 1847. He came into the Civil War with more real combat experience than most of the officers on either side. He served competently across multiple theaters of the Confederate war effort. When the surrender came, Loring did not stay to face Reconstruction. He did not switch sides. He did not pick up a new political identity. He sailed to Egypt. The Khedive of Egypt, the country's semi-autonomous ruler operating within the Ottoman framework, was in the middle of a military modernization project. He needed officers who understood modern warfare, who had seen mass casualty combat, who could train and lead forces at scale. His agents recruited veterans from both sides of the American Civil War. Loring accepted a commission as a general in the Egyptian army. He was not alone. Several dozen American veterans, Union and Confederate, served in Egypt during this period. But Loring was among the highest ranking and the most deeply embedded. He adopted the title Loring Pasha. He commanded Egyptian forces in operational campaigns in Sudan and along the Red Sea coast. He participated in expeditions into Ethiopia. He built a career inside a foreign military structure, serving a foreign government, fighting in wars that had nothing to do with the country he had just helped tear apart. He lived this life for years. When he eventually returned to the United States, he settled in New York. He wrote a memoir about his Egyptian years, an account that received some attention at the time. Then, like the experience itself, it faded. His Egyptian career does not appear in most Civil War histories. It does not appear in most accounts of Confederate generals' post-war lives. It is treated, when acknowledged at all, as a curiosity, colorful, eccentric, not quite serious enough to deserve sustained attention. But ask yourself why. A senior Confederate officer, rather than face the consequences of a lost war, relocated to North Africa, and spent years commanding foreign troops in foreign wars. That is not a footnote. That is a significant fact about what post-war accountability, or the absence of it, actually looked like. The reason it reads as a footnote because the narrative frame that developed around the Confederate post-war experience had no room for it. The frame required tragedy and dignity. A general hiring himself out to an Egyptian ruler does not look tragic. It does not look dignified. It looks like flight, so it was ignored. Nathan Bedford Forrest was not the kind of man who could be made to look dignified through selective memory. His history was too explicit, his actions too documented, his post-war choices too visible to simply erase. So they did something different with Forrest. They kept him and rebuilt him from the ground up. Forrest, before the Civil War, was a Memphis slave trader. He had made his fortune buying and selling human beings. He was not a reluctant participant in the institution. He was an active, successful, profit-motivated operator in one of the most brutal commercial systems the country had ever produced. That is not contested. It is what he was. During the war, he became an effective cavalry commander. He was also present at Fort Pillow in April 1864, where Confederate forces under his command killed Union soldiers, many of them black, who had surrendered or were attempting to surrender. The precise degree of his personal command responsibility for what happened at Fort Pillow has been debated for over a century. What has not been seriously contested is that a massacre occurred, that it was racially targeted, and that Forrest was in command. After the war, Forrest helped organize the Ku Klux Klan and became its first Grand Wizard. This needs to be understood in precise terms. The Klan of the Reconstruction era was not a symbolic organization. It was a paramilitary force. It operated across the former Confederate states with a specific strategic goal: the destruction of Reconstruction through systematic violence. It targeted black office holders, black voters, white Republican politicians, and anyone who supported the integration of black Americans into civic life. Its methods included assassination, arson, beating, and mass murder. The congressional hearings of the early 1870s produced thousands of pages of testimony documenting the scale of the violence. Communities in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and across the South described sustained terror campaigns that were organized, tactical, and effective. Reconstruction governments could not function. Freedmen could not vote. The political project of rebuilding Southern society on an integrated basis was being systematically dismantled by force. Forrest was called before Congress. He denied his involvement. He claimed he had disbanded the Klan because it had grown uncontrollable. Historians have argued ever since about what he actually ordered and what he merely tolerated. What is not in dispute is that he built the organization, that it committed mass violence during the period of his leadership, and that the violence served the political goals he had publicly stated. In the years after his death in 1877, Forrest's image was reconstructed with remarkable thoroughness. The Klan was minimized, reframed, and eventually simply not mentioned in the accounts of his life that became standard. His cavalry record was amplified and celebrated. Monuments went up. Schools were named after him. A Confederate memorial park in Memphis bore his name for most of the 20th century and held his remains beneath a statue. Military installations across the South carried his name into the 21st century. This was not historical amnesia. Amnesia is passive. This was active reconstruction, the deliberate replacement of a documented record with a preferred narrative. The mechanism that made this possible had a name: the lost cause. The term was coined by journalist Edward Pollard in 1866, barely a year after the surrender. The lost cause was not a single document or a single organization. It was a coordinated cultural project, carried forward by overlapping institutions, that worked for decades to redefine what the Civil War had been about, who the Confederate soldiers were, and what the outcome meant. Its core claims were straightforward. The war had not been about slavery, or had only marginally been about slavery. It had been a constitutional dispute over states' rights. Confederate soldiers had been honorable men defending their homes. Robert E. Lee had been a Christian gentleman of impeccable character. The Confederacy had been noble in defeat. Reconstruction had been a corrupt imposition by Northern opportunists and their black political allies, and the violence used to end it had been a natural and understandable response. Every one of these claims was contradicted by the primary documents of the Confederacy itself. The secession declarations, the Confederate Constitution, the explicit statements of Confederate political leaders at the time of secession, all of which identified the preservation of slavery as the central cause. But the lost cause did not engage with primary documents. It worked through culture, through monuments, through educational institutions, and through the patient, systematic replacement of the historical record. The United Daughters of the Confederacy were among the most effective instruments of this project. Founded in 1894, the UDC pursued a textbook campaign that was explicit in its goals. The organization's guidelines for acceptable educational material specified that books used in Southern schools should present the Confederate cause sympathetically, that the word rebel should not be applied to Confederate soldiers, and that the institution of slavery should not be described as the cause of the war. They lobbied textbook publishers. They pressured school boards. They succeeded in ways that shaped what 2 or 3 generations of American children, not just in the South, were taught about the Civil War. Within that framework, the actual post-war lives of Confederate generals were a serious problem. Longstreet's story, a general who acknowledged Confederate defeat, cooperated with Reconstruction, and led integrated forces against white supremacists, was incompatible with the lost cause narrative on every level. So the UDC and the veterans organizations that operated in alignment with it did not just ignore Longstreet. They constructed a counter-narrative. He became the man who had failed Lee. He became the general whose slowness had cost the Confederacy Gettysburg, and by extension, the war. His political transformation was recast as the self-interested betrayal of a man without loyalty. The slander was repeated so consistently, across so many publications and speeches and memorial events, that it acquired the texture of historical consensus. Loring's Egyptian years were simply not discussed. There was no narrative benefit to explaining that a Confederate general had spent the post-war period as a mercenary in North Africa. The image of Confederate officers that the lost cause required was one of men who had returned to their land, shouldered their losses, and accepted the end of the war with stoic Christian resolve. Loring's actual biography broke that image too completely to be incorporated. Silence was easier than explanation. And Forrest's violence was repackaged as resistance. The Klan's terror campaign against Reconstruction was reframed as a defensive response by Southern communities to Northern occupation and the disorder of an imposed political system. The assassinations and massacres were not acknowledged. The political outcomes the violence produced were described as a restoration of order. Forrest himself was elevated to the status of a defender of his people, a cavalry genius, a figure of Southern pride. The gap between what the historical record showed and what the commemorative culture claimed was not acknowledged. It was simply not visible to people who learned their history from sources the lost cause had already shaped. The monuments that rose across the South between 1890 and 1950 were not expressions of grief. They were built during periods of racial tension, during Jim Crow, during the early civil rights movement, and their placement in courthouses, in front of schools, in town squares, was a statement about who public space belonged to. They were built to communicate power, not to preserve memory. The history they claimed to honor was one that had been edited specifically to serve that communication. What took over a century to begin recovering was the actual record, the documented, primary source history of what these men did, who they were, and what the cause they served actually stood for. Longstreet, rehabilitated slowly and incompletely by historians who bothered to read the original sources, now occupies a complicated position in Civil War scholarship. Respected as a general, remarkable as a post-war figure, still not nearly as well known as the slander that was built around him. Loring remains obscure, a footnote, which is itself a testament to how thoroughly a life can be rendered invisible when it contradicts the narrative that surrounds it. Forrest's monuments began coming down in the 21st century, contested, litigated, and in some cases physically removed by city governments that had decided the weight of what the historical record actually showed was too heavy to keep honoring. The question worth sitting with is not whether any of this is surprising. The question is what it tells you about how historical memory actually works. Not through the honest preservation of events, but through the sustained effort of institutions that understand the present value of controlling the past. The men who lost the Civil War did not control the battlefield. They did not control the outcome. But for nearly a century, they controlled the story. They built the monuments. They wrote the textbooks. They shaped what schoolchildren across the United States were told that the war meant, who the generals were, and what America owed to their memory. And the history that was kept from you was not kept from you by accident. It was kept from you because it was inconvenient, because the real story, the complicated, embarrassing, violent, contradictory truth of what these men actually did, made the mythology impossible to sustain. The victors won the war. But losing, when you do it with enough patience, enough money, and enough control over what the next generation reads, turns out to have its own kind of power. Think about that the next time someone tells you that history doesn't lie.